has two divisions, and the two divisions are sympathetic and parasympathetic, and those two divisions are referred to as what? Good. Fight or flight, and rest and digest. And the visceral reflex, well, the barrel reflex is an example of a visceral reflex in response to high blood pressure. So again, one of the main things I want you all to get from this chapter is how important the autonomic nervous system is in maintaining homeostasis. This was just one example how the autonomic nervous system is in control even when we don't recognize or realize what it's doing. So the autonomic nervous system works in secrecy. It's involuntary, which means that we don't control it. But it's vital because there are certain things that the body has to be aware of when we're not even aware of it. And it has to be able to respond to those changes in order for our cells, tissues, and organs to continue to function properly. So these built-in mechanisms are what we'll be talking about here. And again, the reason I go over this chapter first is because this is kind of, I would say, the foundation of what you all will need to know going forward if you're going into healthcare, understanding how the body works. And I think I mentioned before that when a person has a disease, a lot of times it's because their homeostatic mechanisms are not working. So we have to have these built-in mechanisms to make sure our body temperature doesn't go too high or too low, to make sure our blood pressure doesn't go too high or too low, because all of those things can over time break down the body's cells, tissues, organs, and cause death. So if you don't pay attention to any other chapter, this is the one you really need to get down. All right, so the autonomic nervous system again has those two divisions, sympathetic and parasympathetic. So the two divisions, we'll talk mostly about the effects that are opposite or contrasting between the two. But there are some cooperative effects that we'll see. But for the most part, you'll see the sympathetic division causes one thing, the parasympathetic causes the opposite. But that's not always the case. It's just the ones that we emphasize. And think about why this would be important. So we looked at, for example, the sympathetic division and how it responds to physical activity. So if we're exercising, if we're running, if we're afraid, all of these mechanisms change in a particular way, but it's not just a random way. It's a particular way to help keep you alive, right? To sustain whatever the activity is so you can continue to live. So last time we went over the reasons why we would want, under the condition of being chased by a madman with a knife, why you would want your heart rate to increase, why you would want your blood pressure to increase, why would you want your airflow to increase. Okay, you all get that? If you don't get it, you need to go back through it. You have to really get this and build on your knowledge later. You kind of need to get an understanding of, okay, this is why this is important for our heart rate to increase when we're on the treadmill. Okay, so most of what I went over goes back to aerobic cell respiration. Remember that? What does aerobic cell respiration have to do with? Aerobic cellular respiration. Something to do with oxygen and glucose. Huh? I didn't hear you. Yes. Okay. A little bit more though. What form of energy? ATP. And where does this happen? This aerobic cellular respiration? fully. You have to get it. To understand it, you have to go all the way. So aerobic cell respiration is important because it allows us to make ATP. Right? Everybody get that? Aerobic cell respiration is what makes ATP? What part of our body? What part of our body undergoes those reactions, aerobic cell respiration? Cells? Which cells? Quiz on Thursday, on top of the test. You all have to know this. Aerobic cell respiration is how all of our cells, all of our body cells, make ATP. I know. No. I want everybody else to say it. I don't want just one person to say it. Everybody else, when you answer and I say yes, everybody else just moves on somewhere else. I want you all to think about this. So aerobic cell respiration, we can't live without it. Our cells die if they cannot undergo aerobic cell respiration. So what does the cell need? And we're talking about every cell in our body. Okay? The cells on my skin. I know I went over this before. The cells on my heart, my muscles, my liver, my kidneys. Every organ is made of what? Cells. That's all we are. So our cells have to be able to make ATP or they die. And if they die, we die. So how do our cells get energy? How do our cells make energy? They have to receive a constant supply of what? Oxygen and glucose. Okay, so oxygen and glucose, and we'll talk more about those two. But everything, look up here. All of this has to do with what I just mentioned. Why does heart rate increase when you're running from a madman? Because how does that oxygen and glucose get to your body cells? The heart pumps the blood, and the blood is carrying the oxygen and the glucose to the body cells. That's the whole purpose of the heart and the blood. Okay? Not the whole, but the primary purpose. There are other things that have to be delivered, but nothing is as vital to our body cells as receiving constant oxygen and constant glucose. Again, I mentioned this before, think of things that cause instant death. Suffocation, right? Because oxygen is not what? Being brought into the blood so it can be delivered to the cells. Okay? Stroke. So everything goes back to that in anatomy and physiology. So I want you all to get that down, and I'll hit on that again. So all of these, hopefully you all get this and you're not just memorizing it. Sympathetic division, it just makes sense when you're exercising, when you're on the treadmill. It's important for your heart rate to increase because what? Your muscles, which are made of cells, muscles have to contract, and they need the ATP in order to continue contracting. So that's the sympathetic division. It prepares our body for physical activity, exercise, trauma, arousal, competition, anger, and fear. So some of these things, your thoughts, as we'll get into in the brain, can sometimes elicit some of this. So there's no activity in just being angry. You could just be sitting there and your heart starts beating rapidly. So your brain is continuously monitoring your environment, and it's telling the rest of your body, it's sending signals to the rest of your body, and your body starts to produce chemicals in response. So thoughts are important. That's why stress, you hear that stress is not good for you. You can just be sitting down doing nothing, and your heart rate starts to increase. And we'll talk about some of that on Thursday. Reduces blood flow to the skin. What did I say about this? Why would the sympathetic need to reduce blood flow to the skin? That doesn't seem like anything important that has to happen in order for me to stay alive when that madman is chasing you. Exactly. So when you're running, what parts of your body need energy the most? The muscles, right? The muscles of your legs. Okay, so you can escape danger. So in order to increase the amount of blood going to the muscles of your legs, the body has to reduce blood flow somewhere else. Okay, that's the only way it can happen. And also reduces blood flow to the digestive tract. At that time, it's not as important for digestion to take place. Digestive activities. All right. So the parasympathetic division, the rest and digest, calms the body functions and reduces the energy expenditures and assists in bodily maintenance. So both of these are very important. It's just that they're most active at different times. So you have something called parasympathetic tone and sympathetic tone and autonomic tone. So autonomic tone is the normal background rate or balance of activity between the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions. It's not that so at all times you have the sympathetic and parasympathetic division working. It's just that in that balance between the two is what's called autonomic tone. It's just under certain conditions one division just is more active than the other. Okay? Alright. And I'm going to come back to this. I want to get to that table that I mentioned to you all. Have you all started looking at it yet? These two, the list, I guess I should say. So the sympathetic effects. So you all should know these in your sleep. Sympathetic effects. So what effect does the sympathetic division have on the iris? What effect does it have on the sweat glands? What effect does it have on pili erector muscles? So most of this is common sense, hopefully, at this point. The sweat glands, of course, when you're running from the madman, when you're on your treadmill, do you increase sweating? Yes. Pili erector muscles, that has to do with the goosebumps. So sympathetic activity will increase the contraction of those pili erector muscles. The iris. So what is the iris? So it's the color part of the eye, right? So the iris has smooth muscles that contract and constrict. And when they constrict, it causes constriction of the pupil. So stimulation of, and we'll see in chapter 16 that there are two sets of muscles. You have circular muscles, and when they contract, that constricts the pupil. And you have radial muscles that constrict and they dilate the pupil. So the sympathetic division stimulates the dilator muscles to cause dilation of the pupil. So again, what I would like for you all to think about is, and you can make up your own example, but my example is that madman with a knife chasing you. Think about, would you want your pupils to dilate or constrict under those circumstances? And you might need to know a little bit of what the purpose is of the pupil. Why does the pupil dilate and constrict? Why can't it just stay the same all the time? Is there some reason why it has to dilate or constrict? Think about that for a moment. So without looking, just thinking, using what you think. Why do you think the pupils dilate and constrict? Must serve some purpose, either way. Good. Excellent. So when do you expect for your pupils to constrict, for example? When you're outside in the sun, right? So that's exactly right. So constriction and dilation of the pupil controls how much light enters the eye. Okay? So when the pupils dilate, that means more light can come into the eye. And when they constrict, that's to prevent too much light from coming in. So on a sunny day like today, if you're in a dark room, you've gone outside before, and it kind of is painful when you first go outside and it's bright and sunny. And that's because your pupils are somewhat dilated, because you're in a somewhat dim room. And you go outside and they're still dilated, and too much light is getting into the eye. So that's a mechanism to let you know that you need to kind of protect your eyes. And in a short amount of time, it doesn't bother you anymore, right? And that's because they have what? Started to constrict. Okay? So the constriction reduces the amount of light. The reason we don't want too much light in our eye is what? It can damage the retina, those cells in the back of the eye. Okay? But if it's dark outside, you want your pupils to dilate. Think about when you first go to bed at night and you first turn everything off, you can't see anything in your room. Y'all notice that? It's pitch black. But a few minutes later, you can kind of make out the dresser, the mirror, the television, the door. You can kind of see those things, but at first you couldn't. And that's because before you turned your lights off, what were your pupils doing? They were pretty constricted because you had light in there. But when the lights go off, they start to what? Dilate to allow more light to come in. Okay? So my perfect example is that man is chasing me at 2 in the morning when there's no light outside. So then I would want my pupils to dilate so that I wouldn't run into a tree and get hurt. So sweat glands, pilorectal muscles, heart rate, we talked about that. Why do we want the heart rate to increase? ATP. Increase the amount of, I should get you all to write that down.
To increase the amount of oxygen and glucose circulating.
Okay.
To make the muscles contract.
Or increase the amount of oxygen and glucose making it to the muscle cells. So you're right. So it doesn't end. It keeps going. Yeah, you got it. You have it. But that's it. So we want to increase the amount of oxygen and glucose making it to our muscle cells, so the muscle cells can continue to produce ATP. Okay, why do we want the blood vessels of our skeletal muscles to dilate, vasodilate? What is the prefix vaso? Or word root. Vaso means what? Vessel. Good. Blood vessels. So vasodilation means dilation of the blood vessel. So what does that mean to you? If my blood vessels, so we have blood vessels all over, but if the blood vessels leading or sending blood to my skeletal muscles dilate, what does that even mean? That means more what? More blood is flowing to my muscles, and the blood is delivering. Everything is ATP, delivering oxygen and glucose so the cells can make ATP. Good. Okay, so in that situation then, it's clear why you would want the blood vessels that are sending blood to your muscles to dilate. And what about the blood vessels of the skin? We just mentioned that. So you would want those blood vessels to what? Constrict, so that you can dilate the others. Think about what would happen if you dilated the blood vessels to your muscles and didn't constrict anything. What do you think that would do to blood pressure? So, think with me for a moment. Trying to think of a good example. So you have a blood vessel here, and there's a certain pressure. Remember, we have to have some pressure all the time, but the amount of blood is the same, right, in the whole system. So if you widen the blood vessel, what is that going to do to pressure? It's going to decrease the pressure, right? So you don't, why would it decrease the pressure? What is blood pressure? It's the force of blood against the wall of the vessel. So if the vessel widens, there's less force against the wall. And that means blood is not going to flow as forcefully. Okay? So it's almost like if you could have something like a hose, and then you have a wide part of the hose, the water would flow slower in that part where it's wider. So in order for the pressure to stay maintained, you would have to decrease the diameter of the vessel somewhere else. Otherwise, the blood wouldn't flow as forcefully to the muscles. Okay, the bronchi and bronchioles, what are they? What do they have to do with? Right, so when we inhale, the air comes in through the nose or the mouth, and somehow it makes it to the lungs, right? What's the path? Well, we'll get to that in a couple weeks, where you have to know what are the parts that air goes through to make it to the lungs. So you have the trachea, the larynx, the trachea, the bronchi, and the bronchioles, which deliver the air into the lungs, the oxygen into the lungs. So and the bronchi and bronchioles are tubes, okay? So they can dilate and constrict as well. So what the nervous system is telling them, when you're running from the madman, the nervous system is sending a signal to your bronchi and bronchioles to make them dilate. Okay, so what does that do? What does bronchodilation do in this whole process? Right, so bronchodilation widens the area inside to increase airflow, okay? Increase the amount of air actually making it into the body so that the oxygen can diffuse into the lungs, okay? So it doesn't make sense for the heart to beat fast to deliver more oxygen if more oxygen isn't coming into the body. So you kind of have to have all those activities taking place at the same time. Okay, now so remember, the sympathetic division has what effect on digestion and elimination? It blocks it or reduces it, okay? So the rest of these have to do with rest and digest, waste elimination, okay? So, and these are going to be activated or enhanced by the parasympathetic division. But the sympathetic division reduces everything related to urination and digestion, anything related to those, waste elimination. So the kidneys reduce urine output. Okay. Any idea why? Still, I would want you all to think about why, when you're running from that madman, why do you think the brain would want to reduce your urine output? But some people do. Y'all notice that? People get afraid and so there are smooth muscles involved there, and they over relax, and sometimes things leak out that way. But notice when you drink a lot of water, do you urinate more or less? More. Okay? So the kidneys have the job of getting rid of whatever substances, whether it be electrolytes that we have too much of. Okay, so to help to keep things balanced. So we need to keep water balanced as well. But what do you think? So if there was some mechanism in your body, which there are many, that could detect when there is a need to increase your blood pressure. Okay, we talked about decreasing blood pressure, but what if there was a need to increase blood pressure? And this is sympathetic activity. When you're running away from a madman with a knife, you want your pressure to be high, because pressure being high means what? Blood is being pushed more forcefully. So just like we just said, if your blood vessels dilated, that would decrease blood pressure, right? It would decrease blood pressure, so there wouldn't be as much force. So blood wouldn't be forced to your tissues as much as needed. So when we exercise, our blood pressure does go up. You all know that, right? But that's a good time for your blood pressure to be high. You just don't want it high when you're just sitting home watching TV and just relaxed all the time. So the kidneys reduce urine for that purpose, to help to increase the blood pressure, to keep the blood being forced to the tissue so they can get the oxygen that they need. And we'll talk about this a little bit more later. GI tract decreases motility and secretion, so we need all of our energy focused on our muscles, not the digestive tract at this time. And this is why it's not a good idea to eat a big meal and then go out and run, right? Because you want all of your body's attention on breaking down the foods, pushing the foods on through. And if you get out there running too soon, it comes back up. You get sick because it's not being digested and moved through the system quickly enough. The liver, glycogen breakdown. So the sympathetic division causes the liver to break down glycogen. What is glycogen? It's a large molecule made of what? A bunch of glucose molecules, right? So glycogen is a type of carbohydrate, right? What are the carbohydrates? You have monosaccharides, disaccharides, and polysaccharides. So what is glucose? Which one of those? So glucose is a monosaccharide, right? If I had a board, I would draw it up here for you. I want you all to write this down. Just get a sheet of paper and just draw one circle like a pearl. I want you to make a pearl necklace, but just make the pearls without the connection to them yet. Okay? So just make a train of pearls, circles. Okay, so each one of those pearls or circles represents glucose. Okay, so how many glucose molecules did you put on your paper? So you put 6. So you have 6 glucose molecules there. Now, whenever you eat a carbohydrate, it's not usually in the form of glucose, but once it gets into your bloodstream, it's glucose. Okay? And that's what the body has to be able to regulate. We don't want too many of those in your blood at one time, but we have to have some, right? Why do we have to have some of those glucose molecules? Our cells are going to need it for ATP, so we have to have some. We don't need too little and we don't need too much. So let's just say write down how many you think you would have if you had, let's say 3 Krispy Kreme donuts. That's kind of easy to eat, isn't it? It's 3 Krispy Kreme donuts in about 2 minutes. But so what happens? So at that time, once that gets into your bloodstream, you have too many glucose molecules. So your body has to have a way of taking that glucose out of the blood. And that's what insulin does, right? So insulin is going to be secreted whenever your blood glucose level rises, and that's fine for most of us who are normal. The pancreas knows exactly when to release the insulin. The insulin does its job in removing all of the excess glucose from the blood. But what does it do to it? It doesn't just throw it away. It saves it. It stores it for times when you're not eating, like overnight. If you don't eat anything from 9 at night to 9 in the morning, you're going to need some of that glucose at that time. So where is the excess glucose stored? In the liver. Okay, so your liver stores some of that glucose, but what it does is it doesn't leave them separate. It attaches them. Okay, and that's what I mean by the pearl necklace. So the pearl necklace that is made from glucose is glycogen. So think of glycogen as the pearl necklace made from individual subunits of glucose, and they're stored. So just think you have a really big pearl necklace stored in your liver. But what happens when you're sleeping at night? You think? When you're sleeping at night, your blood glucose levels drop. So the liver breaks down the glycogen to release what back into the blood? Glucose back into the blood. Okay? So now, why does the sympathetic division cause the liver to break down glycogen when you're in a critical situation? Because that's causing an increase in what? Glucose in your blood. Okay, so by breaking down glycogen, you're increasing the amount of glucose in your blood that is being sent where? To all the cells, but in particular, the muscle cells that need the glucose for what? To make ATP to allow for the running, the movement, contraction of those muscles. All right, pancreas. We just mentioned the pancreas. The pancreas decreases insulin secretion. So what did we just say insulin does? So insulin's job is to remove the excess what? Glucose from where? From the bloodstream. That's all it cares about. It doesn't care about how much glucose is in the cells. It just needs to get the glucose, too much glucose from accumulating in the blood. So why would we want to decrease it? Because we want to increase the amount of glucose. Okay, so whenever insulin is secreted, insulin's job is to take glucose out of the blood. So we don't want that to happen. So the sympathetic division tells it to chill out for that moment. And then the pancreas also produces digestive enzymes, and it tells that process to slow down as well. Okay, and so this last one has nothing to do with anything. Any of this, no situation of fear, anger, exercise is explained here. So on the reproductive system, you do need to know that the sympathetic division stimulates the orgasm. It stimulates orgasm and relaxation of the uterus. Okay, so that's the sympathetic effect on reproductive. The parasympathetic effect on the reproductive system is stimulation of penile and clitoral erection. So erection is stimulated by the parasympathetic division. So that's an example of a cooperative effect. So remember we said sympathetic and parasympathetic mostly had contrasting or opposite effects. Well, this is an example on the reproductive system where the systems are kind of working together. Okay? So you have the erection and then orgasm by sympathetic activity. All right, so the other parasympathetic effects really, once you learn this list, the other one, you all should just have it. And if you remember, parasympathetic has to do with rest and digest. Anything related to digestion and waste elimination will increase by parasympathetic effect. So the iris, the parasympathetic division, causes the pupils to what? Constrict, causes the heart rate to decrease, causes the blood vessels of the skin to dilate, bronchi and bronchioles constrict, the bladder wall contracts to push out urine, the GI tract. What is GI? Right, gastrointestinal tract increases. Liver, glycogen synthesis. What does that even mean? Huh? Synthesis means to build. Good. So you're building glycogen. How do you build glycogen? What do you need to build glycogen? A bunch of glucose molecules. It just the sticking together of those glucose molecules. Good. Pancreas. Again, pancreas produces hormones like insulin and glucagon, which we'll get to, but it also increases digestive enzyme secretion. So the digestive activity increases here. All right. So those are the effects that I want you all to know in your sleep, as I said. Okay. Now what I want you to think about is, so both the sympathetic and parasympathetic divisions are going to have effects on the same organ, right? It just causes those organs to do something different. Let's take the heart, for example. So the sympathetic division causes the heart rate to increase, whereas the parasympathetic division causes the heart rate to decrease. So think about what it is that must be different between the two divisions. So when we say sympathetic division, what are we talking about? With the autonomic nervous system. We're still on the nervous system, right? So what is stimulating the heart specifically? So what part of the nervous system tells muscles what to do? Well, that's where the signal starts. Well, if I'm talking about right here at the heart. So at the heart, at the point of the heart, what is communicating directly with the heart? The heart has receptors. I hear receptors. So the heart has receptors. But what is telling the heart what to do? Just like your biceps muscle, right? Your biceps muscle can't contract unless what happens? What has to happen before your skeletal muscles contract? Huh? Okay, by way of what? So is the... Right, so the muscles are the effectors. But you keep saying CNS, that's where the signal begins, but the brain and spinal cord never touch the muscle. Don't come close to the muscle. So what is stimulating the muscle directly? Not that one. The motor neuron, right? Y'all with me? Make a mental picture. So you have your brain, your spinal cord, but the brain and spinal cord can't do anything to the effectors directly. They need the motor neurons, right? The motor neurons send the signal out to the effector. So the muscle is sitting there waiting for the motor neuron, right, to deliver a message to the muscle. And if it doesn't get there, the muscle just doesn't respond. It just stays uncontracted. Okay, so with the sympathetic and parasympathetic division, you kind of have the same thing, and that's what I was trying to get you all to think about. So the sympathetic and parasympathetic division are motor neurons, right? The visceral motor division. That's all we're talking about. The visceral motor division, which has the CNS, sends out signals to effectors, smooth muscles, cardiac muscles, and glands. That's all we're talking about. So with the heart, what I want you to think about here is what makes the response different when a neuron from the sympathetic division stimulates the heart versus a neuron from the parasympathetic division. Why would the heart respond different to those two sets of neurons? Right, y'all hear where I am? Do y'all at least understand my question? So you have the sympathetic division is one set of neurons, one set of motor neurons. The parasympathetic division has a different set of motor neurons. But both of these motor neurons send signals to the heart. How does the heart know to respond differently to those two sets of neurons? In other words, what's different between what this set of neurons is sending to the heart versus the other set of neurons? What's different at the point of the heart? Huh? I keep hearing receptors, and it's something to do with receptors. Yeah, but what? So, I wish you all could be in my brain right now. I can't get it out the way I want to. But just imagine you're the heart. Something is telling you to do one thing. These two things look alike because they're both neurons. But when one of them touches you, you do one thing. And when the other one touches you, you do something else. So what is different between these two neurons that look just alike? What is different on those? Yes. Okay, so what do neurons release? Neurotransmitters. So the neurotransmitters are what's different. So the sympathetic division releases one neurotransmitter that binds to a particular type of receptor. So whoever said receptors is also correct. So the neurotransmitters, when they're released from the neuron, bind to a receptor. Here's a picture that kind of shows you. So just imagine these target cells are the heart. Okay? And ignore this one down here. C. Ignore that one. Just focus on these two up here. So the parasympathetic division, you have two motor neurons. That's one thing that you'll see on the visceral motor division. But the motor neuron that stimulates the heart, or the bronchi, or the iris, or the liver, these are the target. That's what I mean by target cell. But if this is the heart, the sympathetic division is releasing what neurotransmitter? Parasympathetic. Acetylcholine. So when acetylcholine binds to the heart, there's a special receptor that tells the heart to slow down. Okay? When the sympathetic division releases a neurotransmitter, the neurotransmitter is what? Norepinephrine. Okay? Also known as noradrenaline. Adrenaline. So norepinephrine is adrenaline. So that's why your heart rate increases when you get excited. But what effect does norepinephrine have on the heart? When norepinephrine binds to the heart, that tells the heart to beat faster. Okay? So that's kind of what you're going to need to know and understand to do well on the test, and also next week's lab assignment that I'm going to give you all. I'm going to give it to you Thursday, but it's going to be due on next Tuesday. So here's it gets a little bit confusing, so make sure you all kind of understand this. So the sympathetic division has all these effects we just talked about: dilating the pupils, increasing the diameter or vasodilation of blood vessels carrying blood to the muscles, bronchodilation, because it's causing those smooth muscles to react a certain way. Okay? Parasympathetic has its effect because they act a different way. But the bottom line is the neurotransmitter is the reason, but also the receptor that the neurotransmitter binds to. Okay? Now I want to focus on those receptors for a moment because they have specific names. Okay, and this kind of explains what I just went over here. How can different autonomic neurons have different effects? How can the sympathetic cause the heart rate to increase and parasympathetic cause it to decrease? Okay, constricting some vessels but dilating others. And it has to do with which neurotransmitter is released and also what the receptor is on the target organ. So receptors. So the naming of the receptors becomes important because on the test, medications you may see have these terms in them and you need to understand how they're working. So the acetylcholine, ACH, any receptor that acetylcholine binds to is called a cholinergic receptor. Okay, so anytime you see cholinergic, you should be thinking acetylcholine. Okay, so acetylcholine binds to cholinergic receptors. So that means the heart has cholinergic receptors, right? So when the autonomic nervous system, the parasympathetic division, releases acetylcholine, that acetylcholine binds to cholinergic receptors on the heart. But there are two types of cholinergic receptors. The ones on the heart are called muscarinic receptors. Okay? And you all learned in 201 that skeletal muscles contract when acetylcholine binds to them also. Remember that? So acetylcholine leaves your skeletal, the neurons, the motor neurons, and the acetylcholine binds to the receptors on your skeletal muscles. On your skeletal muscles, you have nicotinic receptors. Okay, and for this test, you don't have to worry about nicotinic. All the receptors we will talk about are muscarinic that are on the target organs that we'll discuss. Okay, but it's important for you to recognize that. So right now, somewhere in your paper, you should write down parasympathetic. In fact, if you have the slide, if you all brought this in with you, somewhere on here, I would write up here acetylcholine. Why? Because the parasympathetic division releases acetylcholine onto all of these target organs. Okay, so what would happen if I poured some acetylcholine onto a heart? You know, if you take the heart out of an animal, it still beats for a while. What if I poured acetylcholine onto the heart? It would be slower. Okay? So all of these effects, make it clear, make sure you understand it. All the effects on this page are the result of acetylcholine binding to these organs. Okay? Acetylcholine, the parasympathetic causes the heart rate to decrease because the parasympathetic division releases acetylcholine. which causes the heart rate to decrease. Okay, so you wrote down acetylcholine. What else should you write down? Cholinergic, right? Cholinergic receptors. Now think about this. What if I had something, some drug that could stimulate your cholinergic receptor? It's not acetylcholine, but I could make something in a laboratory that acted like acetylcholine. So if I put that on your heart, how would your heart respond to it? Your heart rate would decrease, right? Because your heart has cholinergic receptors, and their activation is what causes the heart rate to slow down. So I'm trying to get you all to put all this together. Parasympathetic releases acetylcholine. Acetylcholine binds to cholinergic receptors on the heart and on all the other target organs. And those receptors are also called, what was the other word? Muscarinic receptors. Okay, so on this page you should have written down acetylcholine, cholinergic receptors, muscarinic receptors, and understand the role that each of those is playing in causing these effects. Okay, now let's go to sympathetic. So the sympathetic division releases what? Primarily norepinephrine. So think that word is adrenaline. Okay, norepinephrine has the same effect as adrenaline. And so norepinephrine is released by the or secreted by the sympathetic division, and the target organs have receptors then for norepinephrine. The receptors for norepinephrine are called adrenergic receptors. Notice adrenaline is there. Adrenergic receptors. Okay, norepinephrine is secreted by the sympathetic division, and the norepinephrine binds to what type of receptor? Adrenergic receptor. So the heart has adrenergic receptors, and that's why the sympathetic division releasing norepinephrine causes the heart rate to increase. So on this slide you should have written down norepinephrine and adrenergic receptor. Norepinephrine and adrenergic receptor. Okay, a couple more things and I'm going to let y'all get started on lab. Okay, now I want you all to think about, take the next step. So a lot of drugs out there, medications that people take are having an effect, will have an effect on the autonomic nervous system. So drugs may be classified as anticholinergic, right? So write some of these words down and make sure you go home and understand what they mean. So anticholinergic, muscarinic, agonist, muscarinic agonist, agonist, muscarinic antagonist, and then also write down adrenergic agonist, and adrenergic antagonist. Looking at those words, I want you all to write down next to them somewhere what effects those would have on the heart rate. So if I gave you a drug and told you it was anticholinergic, I told you it was a muscarinic agonist, a muscarinic antagonist, an adrenergic agonist, an adrenergic antagonist. First, do you all know what the difference between an agonist and an antagonist? Yeah, antagonist works against something. So if I call something a muscarinic antagonist, it's working against what? Whatever that division we're talking about. Yes. Good. Great. Okay, so agonist works with. So if I gave you a muscarinic agonist, it would stimulate the muscarinic receptor. Okay, see if you can figure out each of those, what effect they have on the heart rate. You done? So you have it. So what about so if I have an anticholinergic drug, I'll give y'all another second or so. You have it? Okay. So anticholinergic. How many have it? Or how many think you have it at least? No? Okay. So there's going to be a lot of questions on the test, just like what you just wrote down. So it's not just going to be on the heart though. I'm going to say, for example, what effect would an muscarinic antagonist have on the bronchi and bronchioles? Muscarinic antagonist or agonist, any one of them. Okay, so you have to get an understanding of those. So once you know all these, now go to making sense of the words I just told you all to write down. Big part of the test. Huge part of the test. And next week's lab assignment. Okay, so cholinergic. What does cholinergic have to do with again? So that's the first step. So whenever you see cholinergic anything, you know it has some effect on the what division? Parasympathetic division. The next thing is it enhancing the parasympathetic activity or blocking in some way parasympathetic activity? Right, so anti means against. So if you have something that's blocking your parasympathetic division, right, it's anticholinergic, so that means it's blocking parasympathetic activity. Well, what is that going to do to the heart? So the normal function of the parasympathetic division is to decrease the heart. But if you block that, it's going to increase the heart rate. Let me explain why. And this is kind of important. So, remember the parasympathetic division, you just have neurons sending what? Acetylcholine to the heart. And when the acetylcholine binds to the heart rate what? Decreases. If I have an anticholinergic drug, it's blocking acetylcholine from making it to the heart. Okay? So an anticholinergic drug may bind to the receptor but prevent acetylcholine from binding, so you don't get the effect. So an anticholinergic drug blocks the ability of acetylcholine to stimulate the heart, so the heart never slows down. And that's where you have to think that the two divisions are stimulating the heart, right? If you block one, if you block parasympathetic, now the heart only feels what? Sympathetic, so it's going to go up. Okay? Does that make sense? Sure? Okay, well tell me about muscarinic agonist. What effect would a muscarinic agonist have on the heart? So we said anticholinergic does what? It increases it, right? It increases heart rate. So a muscarinic agonist, increase or decrease? Decrease? How many say decrease heart rate? For a muscarinic agonist. Muscarinic agonist. Think it through. Muscarinic has to do with which division? Parasympathetic. So if you have a muscarinic agonist, is that enhancing the parasympathetic division or blocking? Enhancing. So if you're enhancing the normal activity of the parasympathetic division, the heart rate's going to what? Decrease, because that's the normal thing that the parasympathetic does anyway. Decreases heart rate. So it would decrease the heart rate. Y'all got it? Okay, what about a muscarinic antagonist? So a muscarinic antagonist would increase heart rate. Why? Because it's working against the normal activity of the parasympathetic division. Okay? What about an adrenergic agonist? Does what to the heart rate? Increases, right? How do you know? So adrenergic, so the first thing you have to know is adrenergic is related to norepinephrine, right? Norepinephrine is released by sympathetic division. So if you increase the activity of the sympathetic division, you're going to get an increase in heart rate. And finally, an adrenergic antagonist decreases heart rate. Good. I hope y'all have it. A few more words here, right here. And this is the slide. This is the main one for you all. So this is what we just finished talking about, drugs and the nervous system. So certain types of drugs, even cold medicines, dilate the bronchioles or constrict nasal and blood vessels and have an effect on heart rate as well. So you may hear a doctor tell you to be careful with certain types of cold medicines if you have any type of heart condition, because it can affect your heart rate. So these words, don't let them throw you off. In fact, the five things you all just wrote down, you should be able to tell me if they're sympathomimetic drugs, sympatholytic drugs, parasympathomimetic, or parasympatholytic drugs. Okay, so sympathomimetic. Notice the mimetic. Mimetic means it mimics or acts like that division. Okay, so a sympathomimetic drug would do what to the heart rate? Speed it up. Okay. Okay? Sympathetic division speeds up the heart rate. So if I give you a drug that's sympathomimetic, that drug would increase heart rate. Okay? So which of those words that you all wrote down before is a sympathomimetic? An adrenergic agonist is a sympathomimetic drug. Okay? So what would a sympatholytic drug do? It suppresses sympathetic activity. So what effect would a sympatholytic drug have on heart rate? It slows it down. Very good. Because it blocks norepinephrine from binding to the adrenergic receptor. And you all heard of beta blockers before? That's how they work. So who takes beta blockers? What type of people? People who have high blood pressure? Think about how that works. So a beta blockers, and notice I didn't go over the types of adrenergic. You have alpha adrenergic and beta adrenergic. So that's what we're talking about here. Those beta adrenergic receptors that are on the heart, when norepinephrine binds to them, the heart rate increases. So if I give you a drug that is a beta adrenergic blocker or antagonist, we're talking about an adrenergic antagonist, is going to have what effect on blood pressure and how? You all should know that. So how does a beta blocker help high blood pressure patients? Okay. So how does the beta blocker work? How? What is the beta blocker doing? It's blocking the adrenergic receptors, right? So the adrenergic receptors, norepinephrine has to bind to the adrenergic receptors to speed up the heart. So if you block that, which is what the beta blockers are doing, they block norepinephrine from binding to the heart, then the heart rate slows down, okay? Because it's now under the control of the parasympathetic division, okay? So if you block the process that speeds up the heart rate obviously slows down. So beta blockers are sympatholytics because they block the activity, the normal activity of the sympathetic division. Okay? So remember, anything that decreases heart rate is also going to what? Decrease blood pressure. You have to put those together. Anything that increases heart rate increases blood pressure. So this is how beta blockers work to decrease high blood pressure. And so what would a parasympathomimetic, which of those words on your list is an example of a parasympathomimetic? Good, muscarinic agonist. So a parasympathomimetic mimics or enhances the parasympathetic activity. Whereas the parasympatholytics do what? Blocks what? Parasympathetic activity. So which of those words on there, is two of them I think, are parasympatholytic? Anticholinergic and muscarinic antagonist. Good.